All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. The day that you hear this will probably be close to the beginning of summer, if not in the middle of summer. And as I've said on several other shows, one of my goals for the spring this year was to record several solo episodes and even prep some episodes of other people's podcasts that I've been on over the last year or two and take a little break in the summertime. And the reason why I'm doing that is that I'm writing this book. I don't have a title for the book yet, but I've talked about it several times on the show and don't want to bore you with all the details, but I will go over where I'm at on that real quickly. I'm almost done with the first section of the book. It's going to be broken up into two halves. The first half of the book is going to ground our definition I'm going to provide some grounded definitions of political and economic categories to help us think clearly about how we understand the nature of political power and economic exchange. And then I am giving an overview of how to interpret the Bible in its historical context, and then a review of Greco-Roman and Jewish history so that I can contextualize the text in the New Testament. I'm almost done with that final chapter. It's gone on a lot longer than I thought, but it's going to be full of good historical information. Probably will be the longest chapter in the book. And then after that, this summer, I'm just going to be getting into doing the interpretation. So actually going through the New Testament and going, line by line, verse by verse, passage by passage, and just examining these texts that have been brought into modern political and economic conversations, and just demonstrating that the prevailing pattern, the prevailing way of thinking about politics and economics, which is a form of authoritarian socialism on both the left and the right, where there's this essential belief that we have to exercise arbitrary power over peaceful people in order to achieve preferred social ends, and that redistribution of wealth has to be a part of that. It's just not consistent with what the New Testament teaches about the nature of political power or economic exchange. And so, again, grounding these ideas in stable, consistent definitions is going to help us better understand how to think critically through that. And I'm really excited about doing the exegetical and interpretive part of this book. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I've been over all of these passages before, so it should go a lot faster than the first part of my book. But we will, as always, we will see. But as I'm finishing up my chapter on Greco-Roman history and culture and economics and the political structures of the early Roman Empire, as well as the way that Second Temple Judaism intersected with the political powers of the day and kind of thought about these economic concepts and its place in history and in the world, I've been doing some research on some specific institutions within first century Judaism that I thought were relevant to what we discuss on the show. So generally, the way that we think about the period of time leading up to Easter, what we call Lent, and then Holy Week before Easter, these are the stories that are enshrined in the gospel of Jesus heading to Jerusalem for his final week, having these kind of grand battles with the authorities in Jerusalem, ultimately condemning the temple, and then being crucified on a Roman cross. All of this kind of is framed in the modern world as Jesus's challenge to the religious authorities or the religious leaders of his day. And so when you see Jesus on trial, or when people see Jesus on trial in the Gospels before, like, the high priest Caiaphas and the other Jewish leaders, it's often thought that this is exclusively a religious conflict, and that when Jesus finally goes before Pontius Pilate, that he represents the political authority. But this isn't actually an accurate way of understanding how these dynamics work. And in truth, historical truth, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders that would ultimately condemn Jesus, and the high priests are going to be conceptualized by Second Temple Jews as political leaders. And the temple itself, the Second Temple itself, was very much a political institution. Now, the thing that we have to understand about all of this is that there is no such thing as a separate, isolated category called religion in antiquity. It just doesn't exist. The idea that we can separate politics, economics, society, and religion from one another and kind of have this neat taxonomy where all of these categories can be isolated and analyzed as individual wholes is just completely foreign to the ancient and really the medieval mind as well. Throughout most of human history and in many parts of the world today, people kind of always just bring all of these ideas together, and they're seen in relationship to one another. Whereas it's only in the Western world since the Enlightenment that we have tried to split these apart. And I've mentioned this book on the show today, or on the show before rather, but there is an excellent book by a scholar named Brent Nongbury, and it is on this exact issue. It's on the issue of how we came to understand religion as its own separate entity. How did religion become separate from politics, society, economics, and other aspects of life? And this doesn't really take place until the Enlightenment. And a lot of this goes back to John Locke. John Locke was very much an advocate for the separation of church and state. He was a devoted Christian, but in a lot of ways, I think he wanted to protect Christianity from the influences of the state. And in his work, you can start to see this separation between what we would call religion as spiritual practices, or however you want to define that today, and the political realm, and that would ultimately manifest itself in what every single American knows, the phrase separation of church and state. But that's a very unique concept throughout human history, and even the people that are the most adamant about ensuring that in modern American political climate, there's a separation between church and state, very rarely do that consistently. We know that people blend their theological beliefs with their political and economic and social beliefs all the time. So even the idea that there could be a separation of like these religious categories from political categories is just a historical impossibility, and it's something that people don't do. It mostly exists in rhetoric about the nature of government, but it's very rarely consistently applied, even in the modern world, which has essentially created this idea of religion. Religion is something being separate from other areas of life. And so the problem with this, though, is that we have this modern conception of religion as something that can be isolated from every other area of life. And then we import that back into the Bible. And so as we read through the Bible, we tend to think about the conflicts, especially true with the Gospels. Well, we're going to use the Gospels, I guess, as the starting point for our analysis of this dynamic today. But, people will read the Gospels and they look at Jesus as purely a religious figure. They look at Paul as purely a religious figure. And sure, they're giving, kind of ethical advice. They make these comments about economic exchange or about government or the nature of charity or whatever it is, but they're all interpreted through a religious lens that modern readers of the Bible, whether they're Christians, non-Christians, atheists, or whatever, we all just kind of assume that the Bible is a religious text. But Jesus, a prophet, going around, Judea and Galilee in the first century, would not have been perceived by his original audience as someone who just had a religious role. Obviously, it's about theology, it's about God, it's about Israel, it's about how God is going to bring about his intentions for humanity. But no one would have thought that Jesus was just simply a religious figure, and that his proclamation of the kingdom of God, for crying out loud, could somehow be separated from political and economic ideals of his day. And so we have to try to avoid this tendency, this modernizing tendency, to read our rhetorical isolation of religion back into antiquity, because it just doesn't exist. And so when we think about Jesus's conflict with the religious leaders in Jerusalem and his showdown with Pontius Pilate, who's the Roman procurator, the governor of Judea, who ultimately makes the decision to have Jesus crucified, or when we look at the book of Acts and we see how Peter and the other early apostles interact with the leaders in Jerusalem, these aren't exclusively religious exchanges. They're not. And they wouldn't have been seen by Jesus's early followers. So we have to understand that separation. And as I was going through I was going through some of my research, I have several books that I've been using to kind of reconstruct the Jewish context of the first century, to try to contextualize the Bible in its historical setting. One of the books that I have been using is Shaye Cohen's excellent book, From the Maccabees to the Mishnah. I would highly recommend this book for anyone that wants to understand Second Temple Judaism, at least from the 2nd century BCE up until the post New Testament period. Excellent overview of a lot of these ideas. And I was kind of reviewing what he had to say on kind of two of the most important institutions in Judea at the time of Jesus, the actual temple that's in Jerusalem, and then the Sanhedrin, which was kind of like this ad hoc governing body. And a lot of what Cohen has to say about this really highlights this dynamic that these aren't and should not be understood as exclusively religious or theological institutions. Yes, they do incorporate what we would define or categorize as religion today, but they're much more than that. So I'm going to read a little bit of this book, and then we're going to take a look at the Gospel of Mark and a handful of passages out of the Gospel of Mark, and just kind of see how many of these texts that we've always read in a religious context can't be confined to just that category. So here is what Cohen says in his introduction to the Jewish community and their institutions in the first century. It's a little bit of a longer excerpt, but I think it's important to read it so that you guys have it all in your mind as we begin looking at some of these biblical passages. It says this, Cohen says this: except for the brief interval of Maccabean success, the Jews of antiquity never enjoyed political independence. They depended on the sufferance of their conquerors. And although they lived under a wide variety of empires, as a rule, they were treated well by the rulers. They were granted religious freedom and political autonomy. Not only were they allowed to observe their ancestral religion, they were allowed to form political bodies that controlled or attempted to control the internal affairs of the Jewish community. These political organizations were the public institutions of communal life: the temple, the Sanhedrin, Polytumata. They were supplemented by a wide variety of private organizations that, at least at the local level, were probably the real center of community life: sects, schools, and associations. Straddling the boundary between public and private were the synagogues. I shall discuss each of these in turn. We're not going to discuss the synagogues on today's show because they're much more relevant to diaspora Judaism. These are the Jews that are spread throughout the Roman Empire and not located in Judea. And I want to focus specifically on the temple and the Sanhedrin because that's relevant to Jesus's final week in Jerusalem before he gets crucified. Now, here is what Cohen's going to say about these public institutions, just by way of prefacing the temple and the Sanhedrin. He says, as a province in an empire, the land of Israel, called Judea in Persian times, Kole Syria in Hellenistic times, Judea in early Roman times, and Palestine after the defeat of Bar Kokhba, which occurred around the year 135 CE, was governed like any other province. It had governors and administrators, tax collectors and generals, cities and villages, but the Jews of the country, who were a substantial part of the population, constituted a nation or religious community that was recognized by the state and allowed to have its own institutions and jurisdiction. As a result, throughout the Second Temple and Rabbinic period, the Jews of the country were citizens of two parallel political systems. The first was the civil administration of the state, which was implemented on the local level by cities and villages, and on the provincial level first by vassal kings, for example, Herod the Great and Herod Antipas, and then by governors, for example, the procurators of the first century CE. The second was the national or religious administration of the Jewish polity, which for most of the Second Temple period was led by the high priest. In some matters, the two systems overlap, creating a degree of confusion and uncertainty. See, for example, the gospel accounts of the trial and execution of Jesus. Again, I think that Cohen is guilty here of taking this modern conception of religion as an isolated phenomenon and importing it back into antiquity. And he's right to point out that these systems overlap and it created confusion and uncertainty, but it doesn't create confusion and uncertainty because people in the ancient world were trying to differentiate between what is political and what is religious. It was really more about which people within this complex system actually had power within this system. So this is what is actually going on historically. And in order to set this up, in order to understand the Second Temple and the Sanhedrin in their historical context, we have to understand the way in which the Romans ruled their empire. The reality is that the Romans controlled at that time the greatest geographical empire in history. It was absolutely massive, with the Mediterranean in the middle of it, spanning all of North Africa, Southern Europe, and ultimately it would get up into Britain, and then parts of the Middle East, where the Persians would kind of be a check on them. In the Fertile Crescent. But it was a humongous empire. And given the technology of that time, it was absolutely impossible for the central government in Rome to manage every single corner of the empire. It wasn't possible at all. And so even though the Roman Empire as a homogenous entity is often portrayed both in popular narratives about the Roman Empire and as kind of like a popular level Christian conception of Roman interference in the lives of early Jews and Christians throughout the Roman Empire, that caricature is just not correct. Like there's no way that, from the first Roman Emperor Augustus on, it was possible for the emperor to directly manage all of the empire. And this is going to become such like the geographical extent of Rome will become such a large problem that under the Emperor Diocletian in 285, so we're talking the end of the 3rd century, Rome is going to be divided up into an eastern and western half. The eastern half of the Roman Empire will ultimately become the Byzantine Empire of the Middle Ages, and the western half of the Roman Empire would ultimately fall in 476 and be divided up into all of these different kingdoms that would fight for power and control throughout medieval Europe. So again, the geographical extent of the Roman Empire made it impossible to centrally govern. So what the Romans did is they divided up their empire into senatorial and imperial provinces. So there were two different kinds of provinces that were imposed, I guess, upon the Roman Empire geographically. The senatorial provinces tended to be a little bit closer to Rome. These were provinces in which there were a lot of Roman citizens, and they were relatively peaceful and safe. The imperial provinces, which were where many of the Roman legions, the army, the military, were stationed, were often on the edge of the Roman Empire, where the residents didn't necessarily have a lot of buy-in to Roman rule, and they were under more of a threat from outside invaders. And Judea and Galilee in that time, that happened to be under the administration of Galilee was under a client king. So it's under the rule of the Herods. And then Judea was absorbed into a Roman imperial province. And so what the Romans would do is they would rely on these imperial governments to exercise Roman power in their provinces. Or in the case of the Herods in Galilee, they were client kings that worked for the behest of Rome. So, nominally at least, places like Galilee were ruled by local leaders, but the Herodian family had deep ties to the Roman, like the political elite back in Rome. And so they were still ruling at the behest of Rome as well, even though they were technically drawn from the local aristocracy. And this was kind of the two ways that the Romans administered their province. You would have the Romans would administer their empire. You would either have these provincial governors who would lead directly on behalf of Rome, or client kings that were bought off by Rome and also rule on their behalf, although kind of indirectly. And the provincial governors were given the Roman power of imperium, meaning that ultimately they and they alone had the right to decide who would live or die and to keep peace. And their power was pretty much absolute in their province. But even then, one governor is not going to be able to manage an entire province by himself. So a lot of the times, local cities within each province, or even like kind of these regional collections of cities, would have their own governing bodies. They would have their own kind of political systems that were made up of local leaders. And most of the day-to-day decision making, including like law courts, how to punish people that were guilty of breaking laws, making sure that taxes were collected, building roads and things like that, much of that was actually done by local political leaders and not directly by Roman imperial powers. Like the government, the governors of the provinces weren't getting directly involved, oftentimes in the minutia of the politics of these cities that were spread throughout the Roman Empire. And so as long as the peace was kept in all of these Roman cities and the taxes were collected, then the Romans didn't interfere in local affairs. And oftentimes when a crime was considered severe enough to warrant capital punishment, then these local governing bodies would come together and they would kind of deliberate about how they would take their case to the Roman governor in order to convince the Roman governor to use his power of imperium and put this person to death. And this is exactly what is going to happen with Jesus. Now, ultimately, we think of the leadership in Jerusalem as being an exclusively religious body, but that's not the case. The Jewish leaders that Jesus is antagonistic towards throughout his entire ministry were seen as very much real political leaders in Jesus's time, and they had actual political power. Now, it wasn't the power of the imperium that the Roman governor had, which is why they had to get his permission to execute Jesus in the first place, but they still exercised real political power and should be seen as both political and religious leaders. And this is why these categories don't even quite work. And maybe these words are anachronistic, but I'm just making the point to say that when Jesus is in conflict with these people, we have to understand that the leaders that he is fighting are people that are that are that they are viewed as political authority, and they have real political power. Like, they can make decisions that impact people's lives. Yes, they obviously have to defer to Rome, but as long as they maintain the peace, everything's fine. And this is actually a very wise policy on part of the Romans, because the Romans realized, and you can kind of see this in the narratives of Jesus's trial and the Gospels. These Roman governors often don't know very much at all about local culture or customs, and so they would defer to these lesser political leaders to help them make decisions about how to rule effectively. Because again, the primary responsibility of these Roman governors were to collect taxes and make sure that peace was ensured. And so as long as the residents of that province were happy, or at least maybe not happy, but as long as they weren't in a state of active rebellion, then everything was going to be fine. And so this is a really important concept that we have to understand as we're reading the Gospels. And one of the things that I'm going to argue in my book is that many of these interactions have even when they're being interpreted by critical New Testament scholars, people that have done really great historical work, too much of the time when people look at these stories in the Gospels, even if they're professionals, they wind up sliding back into that dichotomy between religion and politics. And we simply can't do that if we want to come to a comprehensive understanding of the nature of political power in the New Testament. We're going to see that it's actually a lot more complicated than this religious secular divide or this religious political divide. And when Jesus is standing trial before the Jewish leaders, this is just as much a political trial as it is anything else. Now, I'm going to give a first good example of this from the Gospel of Mark. Now, the Gospel of Mark is the first gospel to be written. I believe that Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source. I don't believe in the Q theory, where there was a kind of a second saying source that we don't have, that Matthew and Luke also borrowed from. As I've expressed many times on the show, I'm skeptical of Q. I think that Matthew knows Mark. I think that Luke knows both Matthew and Mark, and I think that John knows all three. But regardless, Mark is the first one to be written. And when we read Matthew and Luke, we should be looking at how Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source and kind of expand and modify and redact is the fancy word, Mark's narrative about Jesus. But I want to start with just Mark, because this is the first of the Gospels, and we have Jesus's very famous story, which is actually recounted at in all three of the Gospels. It's like the first thing that Jesus does when he goes to, or in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, rather, it's the first thing that Jesus does when he goes to Jerusalem. In the Gospel of John, John has through editing his sources moved this story up to the beginning of his Gospels, I think for purposes of driving his narrative. It makes sense historically in my mind. Here, this is very famous, a very famous story, and you'll be familiar with this. This is from Mark 11, 15 through 18. And here's the story. It says, then they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturn the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. He would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den? A quotation from Isaiah and Jeremiah. The chief priest and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. So we can see that as soon as Jesus enters Jerusalem on the final week, during the final week of his life, he goes up to the temple, he flips over the money changers, and he immediately gets himself into a conflict with the religious leaders, the chief priests and the scribes, what many people often associate as just simply religious leaders. And since he's condemning the temple, and people associate the temple with religion, oftentimes that story has been read as an explicitly religious exchange, that Jesus is defying the religious leaders of his day, and he's somehow defying the religious institution of the temple. But historically, it's not that simple. When Jesus goes up to the temple and flips over the tables of the money changers and gets into an argument with the scribes and the priestly authorities of Jerusalem, this would not have been perceived by any of the eyewitnesses to this event as an exclusively religious challenge. This isn't just a matter of theology. Now, it is a matter of theology. I'm not trying to take that out of the equation, but it's a lot more than that. Now, Shaye Cohen in this book as a really great explanation of the significance of the temple in Second Temple Judaism. And Jesus is going to be pushing on some of this significance in the gospel. So I think it's important to read this overview and then talk about how we might better understand Mark 11 in light of the way that Second Temple Jews thought about the significance of the temple, not just as a theological or religious institution. I know I keep on doing air quotes. It's weird when I see it on camera. Sorry about that. But not just as a religious institution, but as a political and social one as well. So here's what Cohen says. As the focal point of the religion, the temple was the central communal institution, not just for the Jews of the land of Israel, but also for those of the diaspora. So this is intimately tied up with Jewish identity in the first century, and not just for Jews living in what we now call the Holy Land in Judea and Galilee, but for Jews all throughout the Roman world. The annual half shekel contribution and the festival pilgrimage, which is what Jesus is doing in Jerusalem, bound together the entire Jewish community of both the land of Israel and the diaspora. The ideology of the temple also served as a binding force. It represented monism and exclusivity. So in other words, the temple was something that divided Jews from non-Jews. Only one place was suitable for God's home on earth, and that place was the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Shaye Cohen is going to go on to explain how during the Second Temple period, there are other temples that are erected, but this is the only one that really matters. Diaspora Jews respected those that lived outside of Jerusalem. The exclusive claim advanced by the Temple of Jerusalem, it represented the unity of God and the unity of Israel, one temple for the one God, as explained by the historian Josephus. The temple not only unified Jewish society, it was also the power base of the ruling class. Again, very important here. As the exclusive ministers of God in the temple, the priest enjoyed enormous power and prestige. Josephus, a priest himself, emphasizes that the priests carefully guarded their pedigree and were expert custodians of the sacred scriptures. In Josephus's view, the ideal constitution for the Jews is a theocracy ruled by God over his people, which translates into rule by God's representatives, the priest. So these figures that Jesus was criticizing throughout his ministry were seen as political leaders on behalf of God. And since they were connected to the temple in Jerusalem, all Jews would have recognized at least a moderate amount of political authority. Josephus is not alone in this adulatory attitude. The Jews of Qumran created a hierarchic society controlled in large part by the priest of the son of Zadok. Many texts speak of a priestly Messiah who will come at the end of the days. Even after the Roman conquest in 63 BCE, the consequent loss of most of its civil jurisdiction, and the elevation of social nobodies to the office by Herod and the Romans, the high priesthood still enjoyed prestige and power throughout the first century of our era. After the destruction of the temple, the priests continued to assert their privileged status within Jewish society, thereby competing with the rabbis for authority. The priesthood consisted of high priest. The term includes the men who officiated as high priest in the temple, as well as the families from which they were chosen, and simple priest, a division which resembles that between the upper and lower clergy in pre-revolutionary France. All priests claimed descent from Aaron, the brother of Moses, but the lineage of the high priest was superior to that of simple priest. The high priestly families, and again, Jesus is directly in conflict with them. I mean, this Ananias and Caiaphas come from the same family, both held the office of high priest. They're both a part of this aristocracy. The high priestly families and the lay families with whom they intermarried were the real aristocracy of the Second Temple times. The social turmoil which preceded the outbreak of the war in 66 CE between the Romans and the Jews shows that the tension between the simple priest and the high priest was as great as that between the lay masses and the high priest. All priests were entitled to receive tithes and officiate in the temple, but only the high priest enjoyed the full measure of power that such a position could bestow. The high priest and the priestly establishment were in charge of the temple and its cult, but their power was not unchallenged. So they have political power, but it's balanced out by all of the other political players in the region. The Jewish vassal kings or client kings like Herod the Great and the Roman governors of the country during the first century CE kept a careful watch on the temple to ensure that it would not become the focal point of unrest, which is exactly what the leaders of the temple, they try to get Jesus on. They try to condemn him for stirring up unrest in the temple so that the Romans will crucify him. Again, they're leveraging their political power against the political power of Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor when Jesus is crucified. The Great Rebellion of 66 to 70 CE began in the temple, and the temple remained the center of revolutionary activity until its destruction in 70. Okay, so all of this goes to demonstrate that the temple is central to Jewish life, that Jews, even in the diaspora, respected the temple, and those that were in charge of the temple, the class of the high priests, the scribes, these are people that were given political authority and political deference within Jewish culture. No, they did not exercise ultimate political power. Many of them wanted to, and this is going to be the reason why there are many attempts at revolution within Judea during this time period. But ultimately, they still have a large amount of political power. And when Jesus challenges them, he is specifically challenging the political power of the day. Now, Mark also includes in his gospel in Mark chapter 12, and this is in the other synoptic gospels as well, a parable that is ripped right out of Isaiah 5. So in the 5th chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah tells this parable, which is against the wicked leaders of Jerusalem, or I'm sorry, the wicked leaders of Israel during his times, wider than just Jerusalem, obviously. So he's leveraging this towards the wicked leaders, and Jesus is going to reappropriate this parable, and he's going to speak it against the leadership in Jerusalem. And here's what he says. This is Mark chapter 12, verses 1 and following. He says, and he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the winepress and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and that one they killed, and so with many others, beating some and killing others. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Then they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers, and he will give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read the scripture, the stone which the builders rejected? This became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it was marvelous in our eyes. And in case you were wondering if this was directed at the leaders in Jerusalem, Mark adds an editorial note, and he says, and the leaders were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the people, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them, and so they went away. So Jesus is criticizing the leadership in Jerusalem that's connected to the temple, which is the unifying institution for all Jews throughout the Roman world. He's criticizing them in the same way that Jeremiah criticized the unfaithful leadership in the Old Testament and saying that they're not fit to be leaders. They've disobeyed God. They're not doing what God wants them. And so ultimately God is going to judge and punish them. And this is going to be the consequence of their unfaithful leadership. And this would have been seen as a political challenge to the authorities in Jerusalem. This is a condemnation, yes, of what many people call the religious leaders in Jerusalem, but it was also a challenge to the political establishment. Jesus was saying that ultimately the political establishment had been so unfaithful that God was going to come and utterly destroy them through judgment. And then in the chapter that follows up after this, very, very fascinating chapter that I think many people throughout history have misinterpreted. This is Mark chapter 13. This is called the Olivet Discourse. And this is when Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the disciples at the very beginning of Mark chapter 13 ask him, Jesus says, his disciples ask him, like, teacher, don't you see that the temple is beautiful? And Jesus says, not one stone of this temple will be left undone. And the destruction of the temple, which will happen about 40 years after Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection, is going to ultimately be the sign that Jesus was correct in his condemnation of the leadership of the Jerusalem temple was true, that the leaders were being judged by God for their unfaithfulness. And Jesus predicted this about 40 years before it happened. So that's what's going on in Mark 13. But again, Mark 13, when Jesus says that the temple is going to be destroyed by God as an act of judgment against Israel's unfaithful leaders, this would have been seen not just as him giving religious teaching on, an eschatological sign. And there's a lot going on in Mark 13 that we don't have time to cover today, but I will be talking about it in the book a little bit and probably do an episode on the show later in the future. But this would have been heard by his original audience as a critique of the political leaders of Judea. So this wasn't just theology. This wasn't just eschatology or any of that stuff. This wasn't just a creative or reworking of the Old Testament for a new religious situation. This was an assault that was directed specifically at the political leaders of the day. And this is where, as Jesus is ultimately going to be held trial against the leaders of Jerusalem, this is where the Sanhedrin comes in. Now, we talked before about how the Romans, yes, they had this provincial system where they divided the Roman Empire up into these provinces, and these procurators or these client kings would rule on behalf of the Romans. But most of the administration was done by local governing bodies. And in Jerusalem, the name of the governing body was called the Sanhedrin, and they were invested with a significant amount of political power so long as they kept the peace and didn't do anything to offend their Roman overlords. The Sanhedrin was able to make much of the local political decisions that affected the day-to-day life of Jews in Judea. And so this is Shane Cohen's summary of the Sanhedrin. It's very, very important because, again, I'm trying to help you guys understand that this wouldn't have been seen as just a religious body. Yes, obviously, this is the leadership of the Jews in like the holiest place in the world for Jewish people, but it's not just religious. They're political and they have political power as well. One of the most elusive institutions of the Second Temple period is the Sanhedrin, a Hebrew word from the Greek meaning literally a sitting together, that is, session or assembly. According to the Gospels and Acts, the Sanhedrin was a supreme court chaired by the high priest and composed of members drawn from various groups: Sadducees, Pharisees, priests. So, in other words, the leaders of the Sanhedrin were all the people that hated Jesus and wanted to see him die. So you can see this conflict all throughout the Gospels, and these are the most powerful people in Jerusalem. This is the aristocracy right here. The Sanhedrin had authority to try cases that involved serious violations of religious law. For example, if someone claimed to be a king of the Jews or if someone brought a Gentile into the temple precincts. According to rabbinic tradition, however, the Sanhedrin was a legislative as well as a judicial body chaired by a pair of rabbinic sages and composed entirely of members of the rabbinic elite. Josephus's incidental references to the Sanhedrin show it to have been not a permanent body, but an ad hoc committee assembled by the high priest whenever he needed advice on difficult cases. Josephus knows a permanent council in Jerusalem that he calls by its proper name, Boule. Scholars have been trying for centuries to sort out these conflicting testimonies about the body that is said to have played such an important role in the life and death of Jesus. All sources agree, however, that the Romans allowed the Jewish communities a good deal of autonomy in their internal affairs, which is consistent with the way that the Romans ruled every other province throughout the Roman Empire. It was primarily led by local leaders at the behest of the Romans. And this Sanhedrin, which is hard to pin down, this legislative body, this was an example of the Romans allowing a local group of political leaders to make decisions about local cases. And whether the Sanhedrin was a more permanent fixture or whether it was only called into session for specific events and that there was another set of leaders in Jerusalem, there's some historical confusion or some historical questions about that. But there's no doubt that the Sanhedrin represents the Jerusalemite aristocracy that made political decisions on behalf of the people living in Judea, as long as they kept the peace and made sure that the Romans were happy with their leadership. Josephus in the New Testament, Cohen goes on, agree that the high priest was the chairman of the Jewish polity and that the Sanhedrin served him, and this claim is probably correct. With the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Jerusalem Sanhedrin disappeared and the Jewish community was left without a central organization. This was the lacuna that the rabbis gradually filled. Instead of the high priest, the head of the autonomous community of Jews in the land of Israel was now the patriarch, and instead of a priestly Sanhedrin, the supreme judicial and legislative body was now a council of rabbis, often called as before the Sanhedrin. I don't need to read the rest of this because this just shows how the Sanhedrin will morph into what would become rabbinic Judaism towards the end of the first century CE. But you can see that just by Cohen's description of the nature of this local body, the Sanhedrin, that they were a political group and they held real political power. And the Romans gave them a fair degree of political autonomy. And as we're going to see in the trials of Jesus, the goal of the Sanhedrin as a political body was to come together and build a case that they could present against Pilate, who was their political superior. Again, this doesn't mean that these were religious authorities and that somehow Pontius Pilate represents Roman rule. Had the Sanhedrin decided that they weren't going to press charges against Jesus, or at least bring charges against Jesus before Pontius Pilate, then Pilate would have had no problem with Jesus and nothing would have happened to him. So you can already see that this, like I've been saying all episode, this dichotomy between religion and politics just doesn't work in these stories. And if we try to read this story as Jesus getting into a conflict with the religious authorities that became political when they brought it before Pilate, this just doesn't work historically. And so we have to understand even the trial before the Jewish leaders, before the Sanhedrin, as a political event. So this is recounted in Mark's gospel. The part that's the most relevant for us because of the words that Mark chooses to use are in verses. It's Mark 14 verses 53 through 65. We'll see if I'm going to read all of it here. But this is what he says. He said, they led Jesus. So these are the people that arrested him. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. So this is this ad hoc Sanhedrin body that was given delegated political power by the Romans to make decisions on behalf of local people. So all of these people gather together. And then they talk about how Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now, the chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. So herein lies the problem. This council, as a political body, has to come up with charges that they could bring against Pilate so that Pilate would put him to death. And essentially, if Jesus cannot be accused of fomenting revolt or failing to pay taxes, then there's not going to be much of a case that they can make that will cause Pilate to exercise his right of imperium and have Jesus executed, right? So they're trying to figure out a way as a political governing body of bringing these charges before Pilate. And then Mark goes on to say, for many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. The high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him, saying to him, are you the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus, quoting Daniel 7 and a little bit of Psalm 110, it looks like, says, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Which, again, if you read this context in Daniel, the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 is the one who ultimately delivers the kingdom of God and rescues his people. The Sanhedrin believes that they represent God's rule on earth, not Jesus. And so Mark is going to go on to say, tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witness? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. So Jesus is going to say, I'm actually, I am the Messiah, which in this context is a claim to be the king. So what Jesus is saying here is that these rulers that he has been condemning all throughout the Gospel of Mark are illegitimate. They've been unfaithful to God, and God is going to judge them. And it turns out that he's actually the Messiah. He's actually the king, the rightful ruler over the people of God. And this is very much a political exchange. Yes, it's about Jewish theology, and yes, that Jewish theology matters. But again, for everyone watching this, they would have understood that Jesus telling the Sanhedrin that he is the Messiah, the Son of God and the Son of Man, that he is the political leader that they failed to be. He's the true political leader while they're the false ones. And for them, the Sanhedrin was able to leverage this against him and bring charges against Pilate. And in verse 15, we can see how this trial plays out. This is also obviously a political exchange, an ironic one here, but it says early in the morning, this is starting in verse 15, chapter 15, verse 1. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered, it is as you say. The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas, who had been in prison with the insurrectionist who had committed murder in the insurrection. So again, this insurrection is an actual riot or rebellion against the political leaders, whether it's directed against the Sanhedrin or the Romans directly. It's hard to tell here. I know that there are historians that have done some good work on this, but ultimately Barabbas literally did what they're accusing Jesus of doing. He was a violent insurrectionist and someone who's a real threat to Roman order in that region. The crowd went up, according to Mark, and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he was aware that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. So even Pilate knows that this is a competition between and a lot of this is political. This is a competition between the social and political and theological influence of Jesus and the social, political, and theological influence of the high priest. And if you look at Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry, and just the kind of the trajectory of Jesus's ministry throughout the Gospel of Mark, it is very apparent that the people were beginning to follow Jesus and turning away from the local leaders. And Pilate very shrewdly understands that this is the reason, that the chief priests are handing him over, not because they believe that Jesus is a legitimate threat to the Roman imperial order, and he's not going to lead a violent revolution to overthrow Pontius Pilate and the imperial powers, but they do it out of envy because they see Jesus as a political rival. They see him as a threat to their political power. And this is the reason why they were handed over. And Mark's going to go on to say, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas instead of them. Answering again, Pilate says, then what shall I do with him who you call the king of the Jews? They shouted back, crucify him. And you know the West. Ultimately, Pilate's job is to maintain order in Jerusalem. And in fact, actually, I guess I do need to read this because this is what Mark says. Wishing to satisfy them, the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, Pilate doesn't believe that Jesus was guilty, but Pilate's only responsibility for being the procurator or the governor of Judea was to keep the peace and collect the taxes. And it would not look very good for Pontius Pilate back home in Rome if he failed to do that. So when Pontius Pilate is presented with an innocent Jew being given charges of capital punishment by a local governing body, and this local governing body might cause a riot if these charges aren't meted, for Pontius Pilate, it makes complete political decision to have this one Jew crucified. What does he care? It doesn't matter anyways. It's just one person, and if this pacifies the crowd and the local political leadership and keeps the peace, then no harm, no foul from Pilate's perspective. But this all shows these political dynamics within the Roman imperial order that we've been talking about. Josephus deferred, not Josephus, Pilate deferred to the Sanhedrin, who had brought charges against this man. And even though Pontius Pilate knew they were bogus, he would rather appease the Sanhedrin and the crowd that were in danger of causing a riot than allow this to continue. And so you can see how these dynamics work. And all throughout this, if you're someone reading this in the first century, it's just so important to remember that this was not just seen as this was not just seen as a religious controversy. This was very much a political controversy as well, from start to finish, and it must be interpreted in that light. Now, obviously, we know that Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, and then ascended to the right hand of the Father. And in the book of Acts, he gives the Spirit to all of the earliest followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, and then Peter and the other followers wind up getting in trouble with the Sanhedrin. I think that in order to really put a pin on this and kind of bring this home, because this is the last thing that I want to share before I wrap this up, I think there's a really interesting exchange in the book of Acts between John and the Sanhedrin that we should really reflect on as we think about how we understand the Bible in its historical context as a document that talks about, openly discusses these political and theological dynamics in the first century, and just kind of happily blends all of them in a way that we've tried to separate in the modern world, and also about the nature of our respect for political authorities as Christians today. So you have Peter and John speaking to the people in the temple. Again, we've talked about the temple. This is extremely important throughout Second Temple Judaism, not just for Jews living in Judea, but for Jews all over the world as the symbol of their uniqueness and of the uniqueness of their monotheistic God. Their one God. So here's what Luke says in Acts. He says, as they were speaking, this is John and Peter, to the people, the priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to them, being greatly disturbed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection from the dead. And they laid hands on them and put them in jail until the next day, for it was already evening. So again, you can see here that these leaders in Jerusalem, the Sadducees, the temple guard, they have political authority and they can put people in jail. This isn't just a group of religious people like we would think about it today. Today, a priest does not have the power to put you in jail. Your pastor does not have the power to put you in jail, but these leaders in Jerusalem did, because they're political leaders as well as theological leaders. Yeah, I think I've beaten this point to death. But many of those who heard the message believed, and the number of the men came to be about 5,000. On the next day, the rulers and elders and scribes were gathered together in Jerusalem, and Annas the high priest was there, and Caiaphas and John and Alexander and all who were of high priestly descent. Again, this looks like an ad hoc gathering of the Sanhedrin. When they had placed them in the center, they began to inquire, by what power and what name have you done this? Then Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, said to them, rulers and elders of the people, if we are on trial for a benefit done to a sick man as to how this man has been made well, let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, whom you crucified, which is a challenge to their authority, whom God raised from the dead, by this name this man stands here before you in good health. He is the stone which was rejected by the builders, which became the chief cornerstone. We've heard that already. And there is no salvation in anyone else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. And seeing the man who had been healed standing with them, they had nothing to say in reply. But when they ordered them to leave the council, they began to confer with one another, saying, what shall we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy miracle has taken place through them is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem, but we cannot deny it. So you can see this council's deliberating, trying to figure out how are we going to deal with this political problem. You have all these people proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah and that God raised from the dead, and that's going to be a challenge to the leaders in Jerusalem. But so that it won't spread any further, these are the leaders among the people. Let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in this name. And when they had summoned them, they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to give heed to you rather than to God, you be the judge, for we cannot stop speaking about what we have seen and heard. So Peter here obviously realizes that as he speaks to these leaders in Jerusalem, that he's making a political statement. Well, are we going to defer to our God, or are we going to defer to you leaders? And ultimately, we know how the story ends. They're going to defer to God, and the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed by the Romans in CE 70. So we know how the story ends. And so I think that all of this put together just highlights how complicated these political entanglements can be for people that live in a modern world that are used to separating religion from politics as if they're two separate categories. And so I'm arguing that when it comes to the temple, when it comes to the Sanhedrin, when it comes to Jesus and Peter's conflict with the leaders of Jerusalem, that as we read through these passages and think about them, we don't just impose our modern conception of religion back on these texts, but we actually think about these in the way that they would have been understood by the earliest hearers or the eyewitnesses to these events as political and social and economic in nature. We can't just isolate them from one another and expect to come up with a viable interpretation of the Bible. And I think that, again, what Peter is doing in Acts chapter 4 is very similar to what Daniel is said to have done throughout the earliest chapters in Daniel. It's okay to give deference to political authorities. I think sometimes we have to do that. And that is just part of living in a fallen world. But ultimately, when it comes to proclaiming your faith and living out the values of your faith or following the political leaders, you have to choose your faith over the politicians. And that's true even if those politicians happen to be perceived by many people to be the representatives of Judaism. I guess there's one more thing I wanted to add on to that too that I forgot to mention during the podcast here, and that is the ministry of John the Baptist. I had James McGrath, awesome New Testament scholar from Butler University, on my show a couple of times. I had him on last year to talk about his new book on John the Baptist, or maybe it was this year. I don't know. I had him on not long ago to discuss his new book on John the Baptist, and this is one of the points he makes in his biography of John the Baptist, and it's actually pretty explicit if you look at the narratives of John in the Gospels, is that what John was doing was providing people with an alternative to the temple. The reality is, as we've talked about in some other episodes and we'll see in the future, there were many people in Judea and Galilee that weren't necessarily happy with the leaders in Jerusalem and actually thought that they were using their power to benefit themselves at the expense of the average person. So there was a bit of discontent, and really there were a lot of questions within Second Temple Judaism about whether the Sanhedrin and the people that represented the Sanhedrin were really the right leaders. And so when John the Baptist goes out to the Jordan River and baptizes people, saying that they can be forgiven if they undergo the process of baptism and telling them to repent for the kingdom of God is at hand, that challenges the authority of the leaders in the temple, and that challenges the institution of the temple itself. It's almost like John is creating a counter temple in the wilderness where he's reconstituting the people of God away from the official centers of power. And there's a reason why John the Baptist was popular and then was ultimately beheaded. He was perceived as a threat to the establishment, which many people in Judea and Galilee at that time would have agreed with John that the establishment needed to be challenged. And he was ultimately killed by the aristocracy that had a political allegiance or a political alignment with the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So all of these things are blended together. And if I have to close this out by making one point, it is just that when you are reading the New Testament, please remember that we have to understand all of these stories, all of these narratives, all of the everything. It all has to be understood in its own historical context. And we can't assume that the ancient world differentiated between religion and politics like we do in the modern world. They were all just happily mixed up. And if we ever want to really understand what's going on in the Bible, then we have to start with that, and we can't lose sight of that. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Again, I really appreciate you supporting the show. This summer, like I said, my schedule is going to be a little bit different. I always have a new episode for you on Tuesday, but there'll be a lot of me on other people's podcast, riffing on stuff that maybe we haven't talked about on my show yet. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun for you guys. And I'm looking forward to getting some time to write this. And again, I hope I'm recording this right now at the beginning of May. I have no idea when this is going to come out. It'll either come out in late May or early June, probably, or maybe sometime in July. I don't really know. It'll come out in the next couple of months. But I really do hope to have a manuscript for this book finished by like the end of next winter. That's the goal. So that's why I'm taking some time off, not doing as many interviews this summer. I want to devote as much of my time as possible to getting this book written so that I can get it in your hands and you can start thinking about all of these great things for yourself. So guys, as always, I really appreciate your support. I just love that you guys listen to the show every week. It's very humbling to know that there are hundreds of people that tune in to hear me talk about this, the Sanhedrin, the temple and second temple Jewish politics. Just amazing that there are people out there that actually care about these issues and realize the enduring relevance of them for our world today. So I hope you got something out of this. As always, please follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Follow me on YouTube, also at ProLibertyPod. Support the show by going to libertarianchristians.com and donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute or buying all of my merch. Those highball glasses are really nice. And if you're like me, the only time that I like to put ice in my whiskey is during the summer. These are the hot summer months. A little bourbon on ice is always fantastic. And so get yourself a highball glass or maybe a mug. You want some coffee in the morning or whatever other merch they have available at our store. Thank you guys so much for listening today. We love you guys, and we'll see you on Tuesday.